Welcome to Chapter 15, the Evidence for Evolution. After this lecture, you should have learned the following things. So you should be able to explain how the fossil record can reveal information about evolutionary change, understand how important transitional fossils are to the fossil record, and know how anatomy and DNA can be powerful tools in understanding evolution. So all of Chapter 15 is really heavily focused on fossils, and more specifically Tiktaalik, which we'll talk about in just a second. Okay, so the fossil record. How do we have a fossil record? Well, it's because people or paleontologists have discovered fossils. So who are these paleontologists? Paleontologists are just scientists who study ancient life by means of the fossil record. So you guys have probably heard about them. They're probably most specifically famous for dinosaurs, right? That's what we think of quite often when we're thinking about different archaeological digs and stuff like that. We're thinking of paleontologists actually who are studying fossil records. So paleontologists often also find fossils of many extinct species, including dinosaurs. So the fossil record is basically just a collection of fossils that we have dating back to different time periods. And a fossil is just preserved remains or impressions of once living organisms. Does everything fossilize? No, right? Not everything can fossilize. When we do have these fossils, then if we do find them at least, we can complete a fossil record, which is just the assemblage of fossils arranged in order of age. So it provides some evidence for how species change over time, and it's really, really good evidence for evolution because we can look at different time periods essentially and what species survived during that time period and understand how and possibly why they changed, because we do know at some points in time what sort of events occurred, like say an ice age or a great meteor hit the earth. Different things like that. We have evidence from a few different things, but one of them is the fossil record and how these species are changing. So how do fossils form? Again, not everything necessarily fossilizes, right? So we've got to kind of consider what would be most likely to fossilize. And you're a lot more likely to fossilize if you have a bony skeleton or a really hard shell. And the other thing that has to happen is you have to be covered really quickly upon death, or be able to create some sort of imprint in special types of sediment. So what ends up happening, right, is we have our organism and our organism dies. So we start here. Once our organism dies, then we have to ask, was it preserved by some sort of rapid freezing, desiccation, or burial in amber, very Jurassic Park-like over here, or was it preserved by a rapid burial within the sediment layers? If neither of those things happened, we are not forming any sort of fossil. But if either of these happened, then we can have different types of fossils, basically. So we can have one through mineralization, or we can have a fossil that's formed an imprint or a mold. And this usually happens when you're in soft mud, and it's buried essentially really, really quickly. So either of these, we can find fossils, and we found many, many fossils throughout time that support evolution of different species throughout Earth's time period, essentially. So your chapter focuses pretty heavily on this little guy that we call Tiktaalik. He's a super important part of evolution of vertebrates. Vertebrates are just any animal that has a bony or cartilaginous backbone. So we are vertebrates, fish are vertebrates, anything with a backbone is a vertebrate, as opposed to an invertebrate that does not have a backbone. Okay, and Tiktaalik is kind of cool because he's a good intermediate fossil. So he kind of came at a time where animals were transitioning from the sea onto land. A little bit ahead of myself, but yeah, he's our transition between fish and land-dwelling animals. And again, fossil records are really good evidence for evolution. So evolution in this case is, we're specifically talking about something that Darwin mentioned first, was what we call descent with modification. And descent with modification is basically just the idea that all living things are related and different species emerge over time due to natural selection. So we've talked about what makes a species, right? They have to be able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring, but that happens usually over time through natural selection. So we do have differences, in species, and we do kind of deviate from different species to form new species over time through descent with modification. And not all organisms are preserved. They have to be either buried really quickly or preserved in some weird way where they're covered really quick or they make a special imprint. So, because of that, our fossil record isn't a complete record of past life. But we've got a pretty good idea, basically through finding these fossils, to show the arc of life. So we've found enough fossils in different transitional time periods that we can kind of piece together what life has looked like in different periods. So in order to read the fossil record, you're basically looking at an ordered succession of evolution. So we're starting here, right? This is our furthest point in time, essentially. So we're looking at 55 million years ago if you're looking down here at the Hyracotherium. 4-padded toes, lives in forest. This is essentially coming right after our common ancestor. And a common ancestor is essentially just like it sounds. It's the common ancestor that all of these species here have diverged from. Okay, so they all share something in common and they're all related. We can look at this fossil record to see the changes over time in this family of organisms. So we're starting with a common ancestor, we're going to Hyracotherium, and we're ending with what is essentially our modern day horse. And you can see that they do look pretty different, although there are some similarities, and we have fossils indicating that this is how the species has evolved over time. And again, I'm sure there's many other fossils and lots of different examples of this evolution, but we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 examples here. And there might be more that we know of, but there might also not be. There might only be 6 examples of how modern day horses came to be how they look like today, essentially, through evolution, starting with our common ancestor here. So your book mostly talks about these researchers that had heard about this site in northern Canada in way up in the Arctic that showed fossils from about 375 to 400 million years ago, I think. And that's kind of exactly what they were looking for. They were looking for some sort of transitional fossil in this time period. Oh yeah, 375 to 380 million years ago. So at this point in time, we had no land-dwelling vertebrates, so nothing living on land that had a backbone, right? We're all in the sea still. So this is kind of the intermediate time where they're looking to see how these animals came to be able to live on land versus sea, and this is the intermediate fossils that they're looking for, like Tiktaalik. So when they're looking for these different fossils, right, it's a treasure hunt. You may or you may not find fossils. And then once you do find fossils, the question becomes, at what point in time was this fossil alive? Where did this come from and what point in time did it come from? So you have to be able to date them. The way that you date fossils, actually, you can do it a couple different ways. But if you find fossils, you know that they have to be at least as old as the rocks that encase them. Rocks just keep building on top of each other, right? And you have different layers of sediment depending on the time period and depending how much time has gone by. So you can use something called relative dating, which is basically where you determine the age of the layers of rocks or fossils that have a known age, and then you determine the age of the fossil from that position in those rocks. So if you know that the rock right underneath it is 400 million years ago and the rock above it is 350 million years old, then you know that that fossil came sometime in between, right? Maybe 375 million years ago. So that's called relative dating. That's how you can figure out the age of the fossil. Or you can use something called radiometric dating. And this gets a little bit more complicated, but essentially you're using radioactive isotopes to measure the age. So you're measuring different, basically different levels of radioactivity in the rocks. And there's certain compounds and certain elements that they look for in this, but you don't really need to be too concerned with it. And just know that you can date fossils either by relative dating or radiometric dating. So as I said, we know from the fossil record that life began in the sea, right? So around 350 to 400 million years ago, most of the land was submerged underwater. So there wasn't really a point to living on land because there wasn't that much land to actually live. So this is what's known as the age of fishes. This must have been a really cool time to be alive, but we weren't here yet. So we did have some plants and invertebrates on land. Again, invertebrates are the animals without a backbone. So this is like modern day, if you're thinking like maybe shrimp or crustaceans, cockroaches, those kind of things. Those are all invertebrates, so no backbone there. Okay, but over time, we had more land becoming available, which means that we had more space for life to go to, and they were kind of being moved from the sea onto the land, because the more land you have available, the less sea or ocean or even freshwater that you have available. In order to live on land, it requires a few different things than if you're living in the sea. And this makes sense to us, right? We know that as land-dwelling animals, we can't live in the sea very well, and vice versa. So if you're going to live on land, you've got to have a little bit of a sturdier structure. You've also got to have ways to prevent water loss, because you're not just bathing in water constantly. So you've got to have something that sort of prevents losing all of that water as soon as you are out of it. You also have to have a different way to take in oxygen. Right? So how do fish or other sea-dwelling animals take in oxygen? Usually by gills, and on land we usually have lungs, right? There are some exceptions, but for the most part you have gills versus lungs. So we would have to develop lungs, and you would also need limbs, which is kind of goes back to the sturdier structure. You do need limbs to be able to support your body weight, essentially, since we do have gravity and you aren't going to be virtually weightless in the water. So this kind of also has to do with the sturdier structure of the animals as well. So when we started evolving life on land, we started seeing these things in the fossil record that we refer to as tetrapods. Okay, so a tetrapod is a vertebrate, and it has 4 true limbs. So tetra meaning 4. Okay, important to remember. And basically these guys have jointed bony appendages with digits. So you can see their digits here, and they do have 4 of these true limbs. The Tiktaalik, again, was kind of an interesting case, and it's one that they found up in the far north Canada in the Arctic that was an intermediate between land-dwelling and sea-dwelling, and you can see it in the way that their fins are, essentially. So this is a model of Tiktaalik's 4-limb fin, and it's made from different replicas of fossil bones that they used. But you can see they had really thick weight-bearing bones that were covered in muscle and skin, and they've got lots of flexible wrist bones and digits, and it's kind of an intermediate between a lobe-finned fish, which is right here, and a ray-finned fish. Okay, they also had a jointed elbow, wrist, and finger-like bones, but we actually consider them a fish because they lacked true jointed fingers. So these aren't really true jointed fingers, although they kind of look like it here, but they are more technically considered fins. So we still consider these guys a fish, although they are a pretty good intermediate that we use as well. But these guys also had both lungs and gills, which is pretty cool, and is one more kind of evidence towards them being an intermediate between moving from the sea onto the land. So a little bit more about Tiktaalik and kind of his fish-like traits, and then more tetrapod-like traits for life on land. Okay, so the top here is land, the bottom here is sea. So you can see they still have some small pelvic fins, they've got scales, they have gills. Their forelimbs have fins with webbing, although they don't have external digits, but these are a little bit more load-bearing, right, which is actually getting into the land part here. Their ribs are also long and sturdy to support the body on land, so that's where the sturdier structure comes in as well. Their head is long and flat, and the neck is mobile and not fused to the shoulder, so they're able to move it around a little bit better on land especially. So important to remember some of the things that Tiktaalik has for land and sea. You might see that on some quizzes and or your exam. Okay, so when we're talking about common ancestry, again, we're going back to the very first ancestor, and everything after that is going to share lots of similarities. And it's, again, that whole idea of descent with modification, that all living things are related. So with common ancestry, specifically when we're talking about tetrapods, we know that they share the same forelimb bones and they're arranged in the same order. When we start talking about common ancestry, we also commonly talk about homology. And homology is similarity due to common ancestry. Okay. So if we're talking about homology and comparative anatomy, right, we're basically talking about a similarity of the structure. So similarity of both structure and common ancestry. Okay. It doesn't mean that they perform the same way or the same function, but they have a similar structure. So if they have a similar structure, if we're talking about comparative anatomy, we might just be referring to a homologous structure. And again, they're similar because they are inherited from the same ancestor and they have a similar structure. That does not equal function. Okay? They do not always have the same function and they do not always function the exact same way. So these are what we call phylogenetic trees. So these are evolutionary trees, which are basically a branching diagram, and they show similarities and differences in physical or genetic characteristics and how different species evolved. So we always start here with our common ancestor, right? So every single thing up here has this common ancestor. They all relate back to it. And as you start working your way up the tree, you start getting further and further from that common ancestor. So the one most closely related to the common ancestor is this first branch here. First branch includes our fish and more specifically our ray-finned perch. Okay, and you can see sometimes they'll have little characteristics or traits over here. So you can see that each one of these, so every single trait or every single species that follows this has the ability to swim. They also have the ability to weight bear in shallow water. So when you see this, it relates to exactly where it is, or sometimes you'll see, oh my goodness, you'll see circles here. I can't make a circle. Anyways, you'll see a circle, or like, let's just draw a square for now, and that's referred to as a node. Okay, so at each node here, you have different species essentially that can relate to it or relate to this specific trait. So at this node, we see weight-bearing on land near water, and we know that Tiktaalik shared that trait, right? Because he's right here on this node, but so did all of these other tetrapods. And then as we go up, we can see where we get to weight-bearing on land and manipulation of objects. So the further we come up here, the more distant we are from this common ancestor. Okay, so definitely practice reading these evolutionary trees. I might try to give you a class activity where you can do this as well. Normally we do it in class in person, but it's a little bit more difficult to do on a computer, so I'm going to try to find an activity for you guys. But definitely make sure that you're familiar with these kinds of trees and reading them, because you will see questions based on these. Okay. Again, essentially we're looking at different traits or possibly different anatomical stages that we're looking at through the evolution of these species dating back to our common ancestor. So a lot of times with our common ancestor, right, we can see homology in really early development. So if we're looking at these earliest stage embryos here, they all share very common structures. So they all have these pharyngeal pouches and a postanal tail. Every single one of them, humans, cats, fish, snakes, chickens, but you can see the adult organisms look very, very different. These structures take on species-specific shapes and functions. So again, similar structure, but very different function and ultimately a very different shape in the end. And they're used for very different things quite often. Okay, so even though we have these similar embryological structures, it means that they shared a common ancestor, but they don't end up with the same structure or function as an adult. Here's one example. And this is actually what we call a vestigial structure. So it basically means that it's inherited from the ancestor, but it no longer serves any sort of clear function in the organism that has it. So this is a good example. We have a snake here, and they have these vestigial leg bones. Do snakes have legs? No, right? If they do, you've seen a very terrifying snake, and I am very nervous, and I want to know where you saw it. But yeah, these guys do not have legs, although they do have these leg bones, but they are considered vestigial, which means that they have no clear function in that organism. But they were coming from some sort of common ancestor where they probably did have a function. Okay. We also oftentimes will see these phylogenetic or evolutionary trees where it's talking more specifically about DNA. So we know that related organisms share DNA sequences. And essentially, the more DNA sequences you share, the more similar you are, the more related you are. So we can look here at species A, and we can look at its closest relative, right? And they have a 90% similarity. So they have only 3 differences in these 30 nucleotides. Whereas if we look at a more distant relative, these guys now have 5 difference in these 30 nucleotides, and they're only 83% similar. So we can see we're getting further and further. Oh my gosh, this is going to drive me crazy. So here's our common ancestor, right? And then we're going first to our close relative, and then even further to our distant relative, okay? And these guys share less DNA. Okay. And a very common example is probably us with chimps, right? I don't know if you've heard, but we share about 99% of our DNA with chimps, which is very strikingly similar. However, when we're looking at pufferfish, we still share a common ancestor with these guys, but we're only 65% similar in our DNA, which arguably is still pretty similar, but you can see how different we actually are and how many millions of years it took to differentiate us from these different animals or these different organisms, right? And this is only looking at that CFTR region, okay? So again, the more closely related, the fewer DNA sequence differences that you'll see, the more differences you'll see, the more distantly related. So we've got quite a few differences between us humans and these pufferfish, as well as even these mice. Although 85%, 65%, and 99% are all still pretty large similarities. So I think I'll have to draw on here, but say we start at our common ancestor. Let's see here. We start at our common ancestor down here, and then we're going to go all the way up, right? And let's say we end with a human up here. And then we've got chimps here. And let's go our fish here. And then our little mice. I don't know if I can draw a mouse. Definitely can't, in case you're wondering. That's supposed to be like whiskers. Anyways, that's a mouse. So if we're looking at this, our common ancestor, right? So we have fish are most related to our common ancestor, and least related or most distantly related is us, these humans. When we're looking at these different nodes, so this is a node right here, and this might be something like, has 4 limbs. Okay, so here's where we get into our tetrapods. Is we have our chimps that have 4 limbs, we have 4 limbs. Do fish have 4 limbs? No, right? And we know that, well, we should know that anyways, but we know that because we can see this node here that indicates 4 limbs would only go from here to up here. Okay, so we know if something has a node here or at the common ancestor, whatever the common ancestor has, so does everything else above it. Okay, so this is the way that you follow this. And you might even see trees that have different species branching off of here as well. And essentially these two would be most related. So let's say this is a rat, right? So our mice and rats are most related, and they're most related, and they would share this node. But say you have a node, a node right here as well, they would both share this node or this trait too. Okay, so these guys would be most closely related and would be further or more distantly related to, say, a fish. Hopefully that's a little bit more helpful. Maybe try to post some other videos or something, but definitely look up some videos and try to really understand how these phylogenetic trees work. But that's it for now.